A Ball State University architecture professor has been involved in the excavation of the largest Roman synagogue to be found in such a perfectly preserved state. We'll talk with him about his 22-year association with the project in Sardis, Turkey. Andrew Seager, architecture professor at Ball State University, became involved in the project in 1964 with excavation on the Sardis project. This was at the site of the world's largest synagogue built by the Romans. Mr. Seager, you say the largest. How do you determine? Does history record the buildings of the early Romans quite well?
Well, many Roman buildings are preserved. There are many synagogues several dozen synagogues that are known from excavation, and this one is by far the largest of all those that have been excavated. Most of the others are quite small. There is one synagogue that's known from literature that also was very large. There's a wonderful story about that. According to this description, the leader of the prayer had to wave a handkerchief in order to coordinate the responses to the prayer. The building was so large. That's a story, of course, that no dimensions are given. We don't know how big that building was. It's meant to record that this was much bigger than the others. Our synagogue is also much bigger.
How was this one built, and how long was it in use?
It was built, it was in use as a synagogue from the 3rd or the 4th century A.D., in the middle of the Roman period, and it was in use until the year 616, when the whole city was destroyed by an invader and basically no longer existed as a city. That's several hundred years.
How did you become involved in the project?
The excavations at Sardis were conducted by a joint project of Harvard and Cornell universities. I was a student at Cornell in architecture school and got started back then.
The largest synagogue preserved from antiquity is reputed to be extremely important in learning about Jewish communities in Roman cities. What have you discovered there, and how has this changed or reinforced the knowledge of life under the Romans?
Let me tell you a bit about the picture that we had before this building was discovered. From what we knew before, the picture was that Jews in Roman times lived pretty much at the margins of Roman society, without much status, without much prestige or power, pretty much at the fringes. This building it's very big, it's very much in the center of the city, and we learned from the inscriptions that the people here were a very important and central part of the city life. The relationship of the Jews to the Roman society was quite different in that sense from what we suspected before.
So it shows you how they were treated by the Romans.
How they were treated. Well, not only how they were treated, several of the inscriptions on the walls, just as they do today, the people who gave things like to have their names recorded, and their names are recorded in stone. The inscriptions often give the titles of the donors. 9 of the donors were city councilors in the city of Sardis. Sardis was not a small town. It was estimated that the population at that time was about 100,000 people. 9 members of this synagogue were city councilors. 3 of the members held offices in the Roman provincial administration. They were a vital and functioning part of civil society and not at all separate from it. In other communities, it's still certainly true that Jewish life was quite different than it was at Sardis, but we now know that that was not true everywhere in the Roman world, that in some cities it was quite different.
Take a look at the excavation site. Through your slides, you took these?
I took some of them, and some were taken by the excavation photographer. This is a view of the site before much excavation. This was taken about 1959. Some of the walls were standing up above ground, and this is a view after much of the restoration work was done. We did do a good bit of restoration.
How was it originally discovered?
Well, some of the walls were always standing above ground and were known. I should explain that what we're seeing here is a large Roman bath and gymnasium complex. The synagogue is the building along the road in the center lower part of the slide. One of the astonishing things about this is that the building is part of this much larger Roman complex. That area as a whole is about 5 acres. While they were digging what they thought was just a Roman bath and gymnasium, they found in 1962 this plaque, which fallen on the floor, which has on it the 7-branched candlestick, the menorah, a traditional Jewish symbol, and also a palm branch, and the shofar, the ram's horn. This was the first clue that something special was found here. Alongside that plaque were some fragments of inscription in stone in Hebrew. This piece says Shalom in Hebrew, which means peace.
Yes, we're very familiar with Shalom.
This is taken while the excavations were underway. Some of the earth has been cleared out, but all the stones and other pieces, many of them have been left in place. This drawing gives perhaps a clearer idea of what the synagogue itself looked like. There are basically 2 rooms, a colonnaded entrance court on the lower left, and then a long main hall, which is where most of the activity took place.
What could we compare it with in this country that would give us an idea of its size?
Well, altogether it's about as long as a football field.
Okay. We all know what a football field looks like. Beautiful mosaic.
All the floors were paved with mosaic, most of it in geometric patterns like that. At one end, at the far end of the hall, there was a great table. This is one of the table supports that shows a Roman eagle in relief and some lion's claws, and then the top of the table smashed in by the collapse of the piers, but in that condition when we found it.
This shows that they did live comfortably with the Romans and the Romans with the Jews.
Oh, yes. Fallen on the floor were many objects from the building itself and from the occupants, including the inscriptions on stone that I was mentioning before. And this is shows the name and also the title Citizen of Sardis of one of the donors of the wall decoration.
You know, this looks as though it fell in place, but it didn't. All these fragments were in different places, had to be found, didn't they?
Oh, yes. There were other pieces of wall decoration. The walls were covered with marble decoration, including animals, little birds that you see here. Along one end of the main hall were 2 shrines. This is one of the shrines as restored, and this is the place in which the Jewish Torah, the books of the Old Testament, were kept.
What did the shrine look like before restoration? How much of it was standing, for example?
Only the lower 2 courses of the platform were standing. But most of the pieces from the upper part were fallen right there, in place. The 2 columns were there, the triangular top, the pediment of the shrine was there, the doors, the false doors in the background were there. This plaque refers to that shrine, evidently. It says in Greek, it's an injunction to find, break open, read, and observe. A reference, evidently, to the Torah, the books of the law. One of the mosaics was not a geometric design. It was a pictorial design. This shows an urn filled with water, the water of life, with vines growing out of the water of life, and then the donor's inscription. The entry court of the synagogue looked like this after we restored it in the mid-1970s. There was a fountain in the center of the court which had the same form as the urn with the water of life in that mosaic that we just looked at.
Was it an open court or covered with a roof?
It covered around the sides, open in the center. The center is the area where the fountain is.
Very typical of Roman construction.
Yes, a fairly standard Roman atrium. One of the objects found in the hall was this unfortunately broken piece of a 7-branched candlestick, a menorah in stone. This one actually held lamps. There are many representations of menorahs, but real ancient menorahs that held lamps are quite rare. We were very fortunate to have available to us many skilled workmen to do the restoration. This is a Turkish stonemason who's about to carve a replacement piece for that shrine that we saw. Here some workmen are in the process of putting back the mosaics on the floor. They were removed from the floor to consolidate them, to keep them from coming apart, and were put back. This view is taken from the far end of the main hall, looking toward the two shrines, toward the entrance court. This is where a reader would stand behind that table and read to the congregation.
My, so much of it has been restored.
Yes. This was a drawing that we did to try to suggest what the rest of the building might have looked like. We have no plans to continue the restoration any further.
You do not have plans to, this is it?
Yes, that's as far as we plan to go with the restoration.
Has the working relationship with the Turkish government changed any during the period that you've been associated with the project?
I don't think it's changed. The Turkish government has been very cooperative and works very closely with the excavation staff.
Are there restrictions that you can or cannot do at these excavation sites?
Yes. Everything that's done there is by a permit that's arranged in advance with the Turkish government. The Turkish government has a commissioner that oversees the work. There are many regulations. No antiquities can be removed. These are regarded as part of the Turkish national patrimony, and they are all removed to a Turkish museum. And the site eventually will be operated as a historic site by the Turkish government.
This is in the open. How do you prevent looting?
There are guards at the site, so it's protected that way, as many archaeological sites are.
How many volumes have been published on the Sardis project?
If you include articles, newspaper reports, as well as books, many hundreds, even thousands on the Sardis project as a whole, and certainly dozens on the synagogue itself.
How many Jews lived in Sardis at that time? Do you know?
In Sardis, we don't know. It was estimated that the building could hold 1,000 people. The Jewish community might have been about that size.
Why has work stopped on the project?
Work hasn't stopped.
Just the restoration?
Just the restoration has stopped. The work goes on at Sardis in general. The work on the synagogue continues not in the field, but in trying to complete the publication of the many years of work that we did in the field. The last step, and we're almost finished with that, is to complete the final volume on the synagogue, that complete with all the detail. That's to be published by the Harvard University Press. Most of the sections of that are written. We have some things to finish up yet.
I can feel a great sense of pride when I see the finished project, and I know certainly what you must have feel having spent 22 years of your life. Thank you very much. Our guest has been talking with us about a project in Sardis, Turkey. Andrew Seager, architecture professor at Ball State University. Classical guitar students Mike Howell and Robert Thompson, both Muncie seniors at Ball State, play for us Drury's Accords, a Renaissance piece by an anonymous composer. Poster art made World War I seem romantic. Dr. John Barber, Ball State Professor of History, talks with us about the Elisabeth Ball collection of World War I posters that romanticize the war to end all wars. Dr. Barber, what message was the government trying to send about the World War I in these posters?
A lot of messages. I think the main one was we need help, and we especially need money to help us with this cause. The government posters were a lot about buy war stamps, buy war bonds, appeals to children, to save their money and buy some more stamps, appeals to adults to spend on a larger scale. Some put the message across with a standard kind of fundraising technique where they would have a scale on the poster which showed how far they were along in collecting their funds. That was the most typical message. There were private organizations too, though, who used them. Red Cross apparently did quite a bit.
Were they effective?
I really don't know how you would measure the effectiveness of them. They got the money, but some of it came from taxes. The proportion that they got from bonds and savings stamps could have been affected by the amount of interest that a person could earn by purchasing those as much as by anything else. So it's really hard to tell. You can say in general that their campaign to raise money both by investment and gifts and taxes was very successful. The effect of the posters, I don't think you can really tell. They also were trying at times to encourage people to join and fight. Recruitment posters were one of the typical forms that came from the government. And again, the success of using those is really difficult to know about because they were also drafting people. Large-scale conscription is one of the outstanding features of the way this war was conducted. And so when you have people who have to go to service, that gets your numbers that you want. But in addition to that, if you're a young man in 1917 in the United States and you know that you're going to get drafted, you may decide to join because there seems to be some advantage to it. So those kinds of factors will operate even to affect volunteers, and so you can't tell the extent to which the posters might get people to go join. I think it's probably more important to look at these as a reflection of attitudes about the war effort. You can probably discern that better than you can the effect of the posters in carrying out the goals that the people had in mind who used them.
And would that be the difference between World War I poster art than that of other wars such as World War II?
I think you can see a difference in the mood of the two periods and in the attitudes toward the wars. World War I was much more romanticized and glamorized, I think, in the posters. And even when they weren't making it seem glamorous, it was often an appeal. Well, I say often. Among the posters I've seen, I've noticed quite a number that appeal to the excitement of being in the battle. Some of them portrayed the war, from my point of view, as rather grim. But even then, it was like, this is something you really want to do. In World War II, the posters that I've seen fewer of those, perhaps because they were less used in World War II. But the emphasis was much more on some specific things the government wanted to accomplish, like encouraging people to produce manufactured products of much higher quality, to avoid wasting scrap. Those kinds of messages, especially to American workers, were typical of World War II. And I think what it says is that one of the important ways in which these wars differed was that while both wars were wars of industrial production, that was much more true of World War II. And some historians will even say that what made the difference in who would win or lose in World War II was the extent to which you were a successful industrial country. And I think you can see that aspect of the war in the posters. And you can see that World War I, it was less that way.
More personalized people in World War I and industrialized in World War II. Is that a fair comparison?
They still focused many times on very personal messages in some of the World War II posters, at least. They would show a soldier at the front, or a CB, or someone doing his job, or in the case of medical services especially, maybe focus on a woman. And it was a generalized person, but the message, it struck me at times, was here is someone who could be a member of your family or a close friend, and you need, in a very personal way, to realize that this is your war. That came through in World War II posters. But I think the World War I images were more likely to center on that individual or those people at the battlefront. One that really impressed me for some of the qualities, and it was a Red Cross poster that showed a soldier at the front carrying a wounded comrade on his back, and it was done in tones of dark gray and lighter gray and a kind of rusty colored red, and from about his waist up, the soldier walking was that shade of red, and the soldier that he was carrying on his back was kind of crumpled in his arms like this, so that the whole image made a huge cross that was mostly like a red cross at the front. And so it was a stark kind of message about Red Cross, but it was also almost completely focused on those men. The poster was about 1.5 feet wide by 2.5 feet tall, and it was almost all the picture with very little message, and it was mostly those people.
Now this is the one you were just referring to.
Right, right. And at least to me, I think the message is a very powerful one, made so by the personality that's portrayed here, and yet it's also converted into a symbol that is not any longer the person. I think it's a good blend.
And this was made for the Second Red Cross War Fund.
Right, right.
Dr. Barber, this is one of our most famous World War I posters, and it was done by one of our famous artists, James Montgomery Flagg.
Good name. One of the strengths of posters, it seems evident to me, is a message that is condensed down to the barest sort of minimum. And this symbol, Uncle Sam, is a very simplified way of saying America. And it's also used in a real good way here. In recent years, when they've thought more about the subliminal messages that come through visually, they've emphasized how the eyes, something staring at a person, attracts your attention. It can be either taken as an appealing thing or as an aggressive stand, and either way, it gets people's attention.
What is significant about this poster?
I think it's a fine example of one of the things that wars like World War I and World War II do to us. Here we are, a democracy that believes in freedom of speech, press, assembly, all kinds of personal liberties, but the message here says, you know, if somebody puts down the country, or somebody opposes Liberty Bonds, or somebody's against the Red Cross even, then what do? You report him because he's a Hun, he's a German. This, you know, is a sharp contrast with what we often think of ourselves as being, as a free people. Here we are fighting a war to make the world safe for democracy, and we're saying if somebody criticizes your country, he's a Hun.
Yet we're supposed to have that inalienable right.
That's right, that's right.
Many of these posters in the Elisabeth Ball collection, now on exhibit in Special Collections Bracken Library at Ball State, romanticize the war. Was this the first major war in which posters were used as extensively as this to recruit?
To my knowledge, I've made a more systematic study of what the wars were like than I have of the posters that were used. But in studying wars as I have run into the posters in passing, and I didn't encounter any related to any wars before the 20th century. And then you find a lot of them in Europe and the United States and North Africa. Wherever people were involved in war, you find posters. And I think that World War I, as the Great War as it was called, and the first of the Great Wars of the century, was the natural kind of conflict to bring out this kind of poster art. It also was before radio, which comes between the wars, and television, which comes after World War II. We had mass publication newspapers, which were of course used in conjunction with the war in a number of ways. But the special messages try to put across for appeals of all kinds. One of the most natural ways to do it was in posters.
My next question was going to be about mass communications. Didn't this eliminate the need for posters?
I think that it certainly eliminated the need to the extent that they no longer were a main item in World War II. Still used, still important, but not nearly as important, so you see less of them. But you still find all kinds of countries using them in World War II. The Soviet Union made big use of them. True, I guess, of every country involved in war, so far as I know.
But not so much in the Korean or the Vietnam War.
That's right. Interesting thing, though, in the Vietnam War, some of the World War I posters, recruiting posters especially, were reproduced and used in recruiting campaigns during the Vietnam War.
The James Montgomery flag,
Right. That one was used a lot. But some of the others, one that especially struck me was of a very attractive young woman dressed in a sailor outfit, looking very coy and appealing, and she was saying with the caption over her shoulder, "Gee, I wish I was a man." Obviously, she would want to go to the Navy and fight if she could. And this is a World War I poster, but we're using it during the Vietnam War to appeal to the youth of the 1960s and 1970s. So posters weren't exactly dead.
Were they effective? Did poster art such as these play a major part in filling the regiments?
I don't really think so. I think what fills the regiments when it comes to volunteers is the sense that this is a fight for survival of our way of life. And what fills the ranks even better is the government sending you the message, you've got to go. And we do that in the 20th century.
What can we learn from these posters?
I think we can at least be provoked to think about the possible effects on our society of portraying war in a highly romanticized way, even when the reasons we're doing it seem very important. To think about the effect of doing that when the war itself is really something so very different. The contrast between the fiction of the posters, often it is fiction, and the reality of the war is very great. And I wonder if that's really wholesome, a constructive kind of approach to dealing with war, especially for a democratic society.
And whether you agree or not, it is a masterful use of propaganda.
Oh, it really is. And if that sense that this is do or die is important to a country fighting a war effort successfully, I do think the posters, this is an impression, I think they did their part in creating that kind of feeling, along with a lot else that affected people.